Hi everyone, and welcome to the sew along video for the diamond drape dress. The version I'm sewing today is version 1, the V-neck racer back. So the reason I'm sewing this version is because the other version has a very straightforward scoop neck and armhole finish, so I think you'll be able to handle that, most of you. This pattern, just to change it up a bit, I've decided to cut it on the bias just to give a chevron effect for my stripe fabric. So in addition to this, you'll need to set up your overlocker with 4 threads of colour that match your fabric, and make sure your plain sewer has a ball needle in it and that you lengthen the stitch length slightly. If you don't want to use your plain sewer machine and you have access to a cover stitch, I strongly suggest you use it. Also, if you have a cover stitch binder attachment, so you could just simply attach binding around the neckline, that would be handy as well. So I'm going to assume you only have access to a plain sewing machine and an overlocker to construct this garment. This is a suggested sewing method only. You can of course sew this garment any way you like. So when you're ready, let's get started on the front. So we're going to start by binding the V front neckline. Now the binding pieces measurements I've given you are slightly longer. We'll trim them to fit. You could of course just use fold over elastic, which is a nice option for a very tidy edge, but let's just assume you don't know how to sew a knit binding, and let's get started. So when you don't have access to a knit binder attachment on a cover stitcher and you're using home sewing methods, knit binding can be a little bit difficult. Now there's a number of ways you can sew this, but this is the way that I've always found quite successful. So here is my front V neckline half, and here is my binding piece. So what I'm going to do is, so this is right side up and this is wrong side up. What I'm going to do is place the right side of my binding to the wrong side of my neckline like that. I know you're going, what is she doing? Okay, I'm going to be wrapping it round. So this binding, you have a bit of extra fabric there, so what we're going to do is match the edge there and sew a seam at 6 mils, which is foot width or 1/4 of an inch. Oop. Now I'm going to bring this around, up and over. So I'm going to fold a seam allowance down. So find the midway point, and we're going to wrap this in like this. So we want to just enclose what we've sewn. So it can get a little bit fiddly. So what we basically want to do is, that seam is about 1/4, fold that to the middle and fold that over. Now once you start, it's a lot easier. Starting is the hardest part. So just fold that and fold that. Present it to your machine and just get a couple of stitches in to hold that in place. So I'm stitching this just in from the edge. Because I've got a couple of stitches there, it frees up my hand, so I'm just going to now roll this over the seam, making sure the seam I've sewn is enclosed. And what I want to do is basically try and stitch over the first line of stitching. So that means this fold needs to be over that by the same distance we're sewing in here. Once we've folded it in, we're just going to stitch it down. So fold, enclose and roll, and we're just looking for a consistent width all the way along that piece. Now the easiest way of course would be just to go to your overlocker and fold it and overlock this piece on, but we are going to be doing binding for the rest of this garment. So it's a nice soft introduction to doing the straps at the neckline. What's good about having the stripe fabric is it keeps my width consistent. So that's what I'm aiming for here, so a nice consistent width of binding. And okay, I've gone a little bit off on the back, but it's not too bad for a home sewing method. So that's what we've done on the right hand side of the front V-neck. You need to repeat that for the left hand side, so we've got a matching pair. So to do the other side, once again, so here's the right side of my fabric, and I want to place the binding so that the binding is right side up and it goes against the wrong side of the fabric, like that. Okay, so now we're ready to sew the centre front together, so we'll need to go to our overlocker to do that. So take your front pieces and place them right sides together. And the seam we want to sew is the centre front seam. And as you can tell, as we sew, we're going to run into a little bit of difficulty at this area here. So what you want to do is just continue the line up. You can cut it off with your overlocker blade if you want. But you've just got to imagine a line going straight up and continue that line like so. So that's why these pieces are a little bit longer, to give us a little bit of leeway while we're overlocking. Okay, so once you've done that, making sure those are matched, and I have to be a little bit more careful because I'm matching stripes as I go, but present that to your machine and start overlocking that together. Right, so now we're going to go back to our plain machine and just tidy up this V-neck here, just to get rid of this overlocking and make sure that that sits nice and flat. Right, so just to tidy up the centre front edge, we just need to really hide that overlocking. If you want to, what you can do is push that overlocking to one side and then run a little line of stitches on top of these stitches here. I often feel there's no need for that, but it is an option if you want to. All we need to really do is to stop this overlocking from unraveling. So what I'm going to do is just make it nice and taut, nice and firm, and come down the seam with it. I'm going to run a line of stitches just to secure it to the overlocking line. It only needs to be an inch and a half, maybe 2 inches down, and then you can trim that and it'll just secure it tight and out of the way, so it won't be a bother while you're wearing that garment. Alright, So first things first, we're going to overlock the centre back seam. So right sides together, take your back pieces and overlock. When you've finished sewing that seam together, come to the upper edge and open it out. And what we're going to do is just sew across, overlock across that short edge at the top. Okay, so now we're ready to move on. Okay, so here's this clever little pocket laid out like this. So this is right side up, and start doing this side and it'll make a lot more sense for doing the other side. So lay your pattern this way up. Right, so A and B with a notch between it. Fold in half so that that notch is on the fold, and overlock. So now A and B are together, and we're going to overlock down to the notch position. Okay, so once you've sewn across the bottom of the pocket, we're going to start sewing the side seam. Now the order in which you sew this is really important, or the pocket won't sit properly. Right, so take the front and back and match them right sides together. So here we have the garment matched right sides together, and we're going to be starting our overlocking from the underarm point here. So what we're going to do is overlock through the side seam, through the first notch to the second notch, which is where we're going to stop. So when you're ready, present that to your overlocker and start overlocking the side seam. So sew through the first notch. Now if you're like me and you're using bias cut with stripes, you'll find that the stripes will match at the top, but they won't match by the time you reach the notches, and that's fine. So overlock through the first notch, but when you get to the second notch, which is here, run your overlocking off. Once you've run the overlocking off, we're now going to rearrange our sewing and start sewing from the hem. So still right sides together, come to your hem position. So once you're in your hem position, so here's my side seam, start overlocking up the side seam area. So come and overlock through the first notch here. through the second notch. Now we want to come up to this point here where this third notch is. Now we want to overlock straight through until we meet up with our previous overlocking. And that's how we create that draped pocket effect. So go ahead now and complete that for the other side of your garment. So now we're going to complete the armhole, which also become the straps, with the binding method that we used for the front neckline. Of course, if you have a cover seamer binding attachment, you could just run a line of binding through that. That would make life very easy. So the notches here, we're going to cover them up, but basically that's going to show us where the turn position is later to create a hem, but we won't worry about that for now. So when we start the binding, we need to start it from the back neck area. So just like before, the binding length I've given you is a little bit longer because the exact length, which we'll talk about later, will depend on you and the fit you want. So what we're going to do is we want this to wrap around, so I'm going to put right side up, and then the right side of the binding goes up as well. So right side, so wrong side to right side, just to confuse you. So making sure those raw edges are together, we're going to sew this binding on, and we're going to sew it with a 6mm, which is 1/4 inch or foot width seam allowance. Try not to stretch this as you go. The seam should face towards the back. Now you want to make sure when you come up here that the binding is following a nice smooth line with the existing edge. When you reach this position, make sure you back tack to secure that, and then cut that thread off. Now come back to the starting point and create that binding. We're going to roll that edge, and we're going to come over, making sure that seam and all that excess fabric is pushed towards the binding strip, and we want to make sure that that fold edge is a couple of millimeters, so it's maybe 1/16 of an inch, maybe 1/8 of an inch over. So what we basically want to be doing is stitching just in from the fold, and the aim is to stitch on the existing stitch line underneath. So that's our goal. The reality is you won't get it sitting perfectly on top of the other stitches, but it'll be pretty good. And I'm sewing as an edge stitch, which is just using the edge of my presser foot as a guide, so it's just a millimeter or 1/16 of an inch just in from that fold. The main thing we want to make sure of is that the width is consistent. As we approach the end here, we're going to create a binding, so you have to be quite careful because sometimes you can have issues here and you can stretch it out of place. So what we want to be doing is we want to be folding these outside edges in halfway. I'm quite lucky because this is a stripe, it gives me a really good idea of the width. And then we want to make sure once that's folded halfway that we fold it in again on itself, and that's going to keep our strap width consistent. So whatever you've sewn up here, you just need to really eyeball it and make sure it's consistent as you enter the strap. So just anchor that with one hand and making sure that's all enclosed, finish your stitching up and through the neckline area there. So now we're basically going to try and create a tube, which is our straps, all the way to the end of our bias piece. And to do that, we're just going to fold in and then fold back in on itself, secure that with one hand, double check that the width is consistent, make sure these edges are sitting on top of each other, and stitch through. So that's what we're looking through. What's what we're looking for. So just continue that all the way to the end of your bias strip. Sorry, to the end of your strip. This isn't a woven fabric. If it was, it would be a bias strip. So okay, so once you've done this for one side of your garment, go ahead and repeat that for the other side of your garment. So this is what the back area should look like. I've done it a little bit wrong here. I should have left a tail on it like that, because what we need to do is turn this under and then turn this under again before creating a seam. So if you're like me and you've done that, what you could do is just run in a line of overlocking and seal those edges, but the correct way of doing it would be to turn that under and then turn it under again. So on the pattern there was a notch here marked, which is now hidden by our binding, but that was at 3 centimeters, which is 1 3/16 of an inch, and that shows us the position of what we're going to turn this in by, because this is where our straps are going to go through. We're going to put a channel in here for the strapping. So what you can do is measure down 3 centimeters and fold this like so. So if you do have that little end there, what we're going to do is turn and turn again, and when you have the correct measurement down, which should be there, we're going to sew a line of stitches to secure this down. Now the binding needs to sit on top of each other. And I'm sewing this from the back of the garment, but you can of course sew it from the front. And we want to sew directly through the overlocking. So when we sew this, we want to make sure that the centre back seam is sitting on top of each other. And then turn under the other edge of the binding across to the other side. I want to make this nice and secure, so what I'm going to do now is sew a second line of stitching parallel to the first. So what's going to happen is our straps are going to come down and be fed through this. So this is quite chunky, as in deep. What you can do, as long as you can fit your straps through, is you can reduce this quite small, but it needs to be at least the strap width or bigger there, and the smaller it is, the tidier it will be. Certainly you can adjust that. It's not going to affect the fit of the garment too much. So the last step in our process is to sew the straps into place, but we need to know the measurement to sew. So as a guideline, what you can do is measure 6 inches, which is 15 centimeters, from the top intersection here, and place a small pin or a marker in place as a starting guideline. Now, I can't give you the exact measurement because it's going to depend on the fit you want, and also to quite a large extent the stretch of your fabric. So if you measure down 6 inches or 15 centimeters and place a marker on one strap and then do the same thing on the other strap, then what you need to do is feed one of the straps through the channel that you created earlier. So this is the reason why a bigger channel is easier than a smaller one. A chunkier channel, it just gives you a little bit more room for feeding that strap through. So the position you marked is effectively the join position for the straps. So what is a good idea is to cross it over so that that 6 inch, 15 centimeter mark matches, and then secure that in place somehow.
So it's a good idea to either use a safety pin, or you could even knot it if you wanted to. Just some way of securing that where it's not going to come undone, and then feed that back through the channel and try it on. You need to try this on just to make sure that it is the right length. Now you need to make sure also that these straps are the same distance. So when you've finished, you can trim off the extra strapping, but not until you've tried it on. So when you're sure that that is the correct distance, what you're going to do is come to that join position, and you can run a row of stitching at that point. So it doesn't matter whether you run it horizontally or vertically, either way, you just need to secure it. And once you've finished sewing that, then you can trim off the excess strapping. So can I suggest when you trim off the excess strapping that you leave about 1.5 inches or 3 centimeters on either side. So feed those straps back through the channel position and just find the center. When you know that the center's right in the middle of the back neck, it's a really good idea to run a row of stitches, just a very small row of stitches, as a stitch in the ditch. So that means you want to sew right in the seam. So you need to sew this from the right side of your garment. And you really only want to do a small back tack stitch, so 2 or 3 stitches forward and 2 or 3 stitches back. And that will just help make sure the garment stays in the correct position while it's being worn. And of course, now if you have a label to sew in, you can turn your garment over and sew it directly in the center of the back neck area. And don't forget to do some quality control work as you go, so snip some stray threads off. Right, so that's the end of our sew along video. Hey, thanks for joining me. I look forward to you joining me for my next sew along video soon. Don't forget to join the Trish Newberry Pattern Design pattern discussion group on Facebook for hints, tips and tutorials and how to hack these patterns in other ways. I look forward to seeing you for my next sew along video soon.